Metal tore apart with a shriek as the aircraft shuddered under fire. Boots pounding through thick mud while artillery rolled in the distance like endless thunder. Radios crackled with broken signals, voices overlapping in panic, breaths sharp and uneven as flares burst overhead and washed the battlefield in blinding white light. Orders were shouted, then lost to the noise. Somewhere in the chaos, a single figure slipped through the smoke, moving against the flow of retreat, unseen and unmarked. No one noticed her at first. No one understood that she wasn't escaping the danger, she was stepping directly into it. And in those first violent seconds, as the ground shook and metal screamed, no one yet realized that the girl disappearing into the darkness was about to change the course of the mission, forever, because moments later, something impossible happened. It was winter of 1944. Deep in occupied Western Europe, at a moment when the war hung on a fragile balance, Allied commanders crowded around maps stained with coffee and grease pencil marks, tracking rail lines, supply depots, and coded corridors that fed the enemy's war machine. One failed operation here would not mean a simple loss, it would strand thousands of soldiers, expose civilians to brutal retaliation, and destroy a classified intelligence network built over years of silent sacrifice. At the heart of it all was a mission so secret it barely existed on paper, entrusted to a single operative chosen not for strength or rank, but for her ability to vanish without a trace. She was sent to retrieve information believed to be decisive, something that could collapse enemy operations in a matter of weeks. But as clocks synchronized and final orders were given, no one in the command room understood the real danger. The mission itself was not the greatest threat. The true enemy had not revealed itself yet. Inside the dimly lit command room, the steady rhythm of machines suddenly broke when a radar operator stiffened in his chair, his hand hovering just above the screen. A single mark had appeared faint, irregular, and gone almost as soon as it registered. Not an aircraft. Not artillery. Not anything logged in the night's operation plan. Before anyone could question it, a cipher machine beside him began to chatter to life, paper spilling out in short, violent bursts. At first, the text looked like meaningless noise-scrambled characters, its broken spacing, fragments that refused to resolve into known code. Then a pattern emerged. Half of the message corrected itself, aligning into a readable structure that made every officer in the room lean closer. It wasn't an enemy code. It wasn't Allied either. It was something in between an altered system that should not have existed, as the message continued to print. The room fell unnaturally quiet. One of the intelligence officers read the line twice, then a third time, his face draining of color. Buried inside the transmission was a name. Her name. The operative who had not checked in, the one presumed to be moving silently through enemy territory at that very moment. No field unit was supposed to know her identity. No transmitter outside Allied control should have been able to reference her at all. Someone asked the question no one wanted to answer. How could a secure operation be named by a source that technically did not exist? Before an explanation could form, the machine jolted again. A second message printed shorter, sharper, as if sent in panic. The wording was incomplete, but the meaning was unmistakable. Extraction was compromised. Trust had been broken. The message cut off mid-line, the paper trailing blank onto the floor as static flooded the room. Almost immediately, a third signal pierced the noise. This one was worse. A friendly identification code lit up on the screen, broadcasting from a position deep inside enemy-controlled territory. It was flawless, every digit correct, every authentication marker intact. Too perfect. The kind of signal only Allied command could generate. No one spoke. Because in that instant, every officer understood what it meant. The enemy was not reacting to the mission. They were anticipating it. Someone had access. Someone had already opened the door. And somewhere beyond the maps and markers, the woman they had sent in alone was now operating inside a situation no one had planned for, no one had trained for, and no one could control. Then the timer started. 90 seconds until the next enemy sweep. 90 seconds before positions would be overrun. 90 seconds before the truth, whatever it was, would either surface or be buried. Forever, and whether anyone lived. Through it depended on what happened next. The first sign that control was slipping came not with an explosion, but with silence. On the ground, radios that had been alive with overlapping commands suddenly dropped into dead air. Operators slapped receivers, adjusted dials, shouted call signs that vanished into static. The forest seemed to absorb sound, swallowing voices, as if the night itself were listening. Artillery still thundered in the distance, but closer now to close each impact, sending vibrations through the frozen soil. Men crouched low, weapons raised, waiting for orders that never arrived. Training demanded movement. Instinct demanded cover. Confusion paralyzed both. Somewhere beyond the tree line, an enemy searchlight cut across the darkness, slow and deliberate, sweeping like a predator's gaze. It paused, shifted. Then another joined it. This wasn't random probing. This was coordinated. Back in the command room, tension fractured into open disagreement. One officer insisted the radar anomaly had been interference. Another argued it was a masked transmission beam. Maps were dragged closer under harsh lights as grease pencil lines were erased and redrawn. Someone pointed to a sector marked secure less than an hour earlier. Now it pulsed with uncertainty. A junior analyst hesitated before speaking, then quietly reported that several intercepted signals were arriving out of sequence, as if responses were being prepared before questions were asked. "That's not possible," the commander snapped, but no one could explain it. On the ground again, a patrol moved forward on outdated coordinates, only to find an enemy unit already entrenched. Weapons trained exactly where Allied forces emerged from the brush. The first shots were devastating. A machine gun jammed mid-burst. A flare detonated early, bathing the area in light and exposing men who had nowhere to run. Shouts turned to screams. Someone fell. Someone else dragged him back, boots slipping in mud darkened by blood, and through it all, she remained unseen. Inside enemy territory, closer to the compound than command believed possible. She listened to unfamiliar signals crackle across her damaged receiver. They weren't battlefield chatter. They were administrative, clean, calm. Reports being filed. Movements being logged. The enemy wasn't reacting in panic. They were following a schedule. That was when she understood something was deeply wrong. Back at command, a decoded fragment finally resolved into a partial sentence that chilled the room. It referenced a fallback plan 1 that had never been authorized. Worse, it used terminology only Allied planners employed internally. No one spoke at first. Then someone asked the question hanging in the air. How do they know our contingencies? No answer came, because at that exact moment, a new transmission cut through, stronger, clearer, unmistakably deliberate. It wasn't addressed to a unit. It wasn't broadcast widely. It was aimed, a signal originating from inside the operational perimeter. Using Allied encryption, pinged command with a short burst of data coordinates, timestamps, and a confirmation marker that authenticated flawlessly. Flawlessly, the realization hit like a physical blow. The enemy wasn't just listening. They were already inside the decision loop. And this still wasn't the real problem, because as analysts rushed to trace the source, another report came in from the ground, enemy reinforcements moving far earlier than any model predicted, converging not on Allied forces, but toward the very location she was believed to be approaching. Someone in the room whispered, almost to themselves, "They're not chasing us. They're waiting for her." And in that moment, the mission stopped being about survival. It became about containment. The command room no longer felt like a place of control. It felt like a place of containment. Voices dropped instinctively, as if whatever or whoever was listening might still be able to hear them. Officers stopped speaking in full sentences, switching to gestures and fragments, eyes flicking toward the walls, the radios, the humming machines that had once represented certainty. The map on the central table had become a battlefield of its own, crowded with markings layered over markings, contingencies stacked on contingencies. None of them clean anymore. An intelligence officer finally said what everyone had been circling around. If the enemy was predicting Allied movement, then operational security had already failed. Not might fail, had failed. The question was no longer how, but how long. A senior commander ordered a silent review of recent transmissions, every outbound signal from the last 48 hours flagged and cross-referenced. What came back was worse than anyone expected. Several messages had been acknowledged before they were officially sent. Not rerouted. Not intercepted, anticipated. On the ground, units felt the consequences immediately. An extraction route marked as clear erupted in sudden gunfire the moment the first squad advanced. Mortar landed with surgical accuracy, cutting off retreat paths as if someone had drawn the map with Allied intentions already penciled in. Men scattered, abandoning formation just to survive. Medics crawled through mud and smoke, dragging the wounded behind shattered trees, while officers shouted commands that no longer matched reality, and still no sign of her inside enemy territory. She had gone still. She pressed herself against cold stone near the compound's outer structure. Listening as vehicles rolled past in disciplined intervals, boots struck pavement in clean rhythms. Guards rotated with mechanical precision. This was not a base on alert. This was a base executing a plan already underway. Through the narrow window of her receiver, she caught fragments of conversation, coded, efficient, confident. They spoke of arrivals, of schedules. Of confirmation, they spoke as if the outcome was already decided. Back at command, junior analysts noticed something no one else had yet verbalized. The enemy reinforcements weren't converging randomly. They were forming a perimeter knot around Allied forces, but around a specific grid. When the coordinates were overlaid with known intelligence, the room fell silent. It was the objective site, which meant one thing. They were not trying to stop her from getting in. They were trying to control what happened. When she came out, the implications were devastating. If she had already reached the target, then whatever she was retrieving was something the enemy was prepared to lose, or wanted her to take. A trap not meant to kill her immediately, but to follow her back through. Allied lines like a disease. That was when the conversation changed. Quietly, carefully, someone suggested delaying extraction. Another suggested scrubbing the pickup entirely. The word containment appeared again this time, not in reference to intelligence, but to a person. No one said her name aloud. They didn't need to. Everyone knew who the discussion was really about. A message was drafted, then rewritten, shortened, stripped of emotion. Proceed only if objective is confirmed safe. It was the closest thing to abandonment that could be written without admitting it. On the ground, she finally moved. Inside the compound, she found what command believed was the prize files, reels. Encoded documents, but something about them felt wrong. Too accessible, too neatly arranged, as if they were meant to be found, and beneath them, hidden behind a false panel. She discovered the real cache, intercepted Allied communications, long-term surveillance records, behavioral profiles of command. Staff, they hadn't just been listening, they had been studying. She understood now why the enemy was calm. Why they weren't panicking? Why they were letting her get this far? Because they didn't need to stop her. They needed her to return. At that exact moment, a receiver crackled with an incoming transmission. The voice was familiar, controlled, professional. Abort. If compromised, it was too late for that. She reached for the secondary channel one. Command didn't know she still had sent a burst of raw data, without commentary, without encryption polish, just enough to make sure it couldn't be misunderstood. Then she did something Command would never have approved. She stayed, and far above her. In a room full of maps and blinking lights, someone finally said the words out loud. If she comes back, we may have to stop her. And that was when everyone realized this was no longer a mission. Spiraling out of control, it was a choice. The command room reached a dangerous stillness. Not the calm of control, but the silence. That comes when every available option is unacceptable. Cigarette smoke hung unmoving beneath the lights. curling above maps that no longer offered clarity, only consequences. No one sat anymore. They stood in small clusters, arms folded, eyes fixed on the same blinking indicators as if staring hard enough might force the future to change. A final analysis confirmed what everyone already knew but had hoped to. Disprove the enemy's perimeter was complete. Every viable extraction corridor, land and improvised, was now monitored, timed and layered with countermeasures. Even routes that hadn't existed on paper until minutes earlier were already compromised. It was as if the enemy were watching Allied decisions in real time, adjusting before orders could fully form. One commander slammed his fist onto the table and demanded a breakthrough. Another quietly asked the question no one wanted to hear answered. What if the enemy wanted her to escape? That possibility chilled the room, because if she left carrying what she had found, if she returned through Allied lines with proof of compromised command structures, behavioral profiles, and long-term surveillance, then the damage might not end with this mission. It could unravel trust across entire theaters of war. Every order, every victory, every failure would come under suspicion, and suspicion in war was contagious. The discussion turned grim. Containment strategies were outlined. Contingency language grew colder. If she could not be verified as secure, then she could not be allowed to move freely. Someone suggested rerouting her extraction to an isolated holding point. Someone else argued there might not be time. No one mentioned rescue anymore on the ground. She felt the shift before she saw it. Enemy movement tightened. Patrols doubled back instead of passing through. Vehicles stopped repositioning and began waiting. The base wasn't searching for her, they were sealing exits. She slipped between shadows, memorizing patterns, listening for the smallest deviations in routine. She knew now that the clock wasn't just counting down to extraction, it was counting down to containment. She located an internal access point that shouldn't have existed, a maintenance corridor absent from all known schematics. Inside, she found more evidence. Not just surveillance, but correspondence. Names circled in red, behavioral predictions annotated with unsettling accuracy. One file referenced a scheduled Allied decision. That had not yet been made. A decision that command was debating. At that exact moment, the implication was terrifying. Either the enemy had an informant embedded, impossibly higher, they had learned how to predict Allied command behavior with near-perfect accuracy, or both. Her radio crackled again. This time, the voice hesitated before speaking. "We can't confirm extraction safety." She didn't respond. Instead, she initiated a fail-safe protocol designed for worst-case scenarios, one that would destroy sensitive material and deny enemy recovery. But she altered it, rewriting the sequence on the fly. The explosion would not just erase evidence, it would erase patterns. Back in the command room, alarms began to chirp, not loudly, but insistently. Indicators spiked. Data streams overlapped. Someone shouted that power fluctuations were registering near the objective site, and then someone else realized what she was doing. She's going to detonate. The room erupted. Orders were shouted. Counter-orders canceled them. A final message was sent, stripped to its barest form, pleading and authoritative at the same time. Stand down. It never reached her. The blast that followed wasn't massive, but it was precise. A controlled collapse that swallowed the compound's core, tearing through archives, transmitters, and surveillance arrays in a chain reaction that left nothing clean behind. The ground shuddered. Enemy communications went dark. Searchlights flickered out one by one, then silence. No movement detected. No signal from her device. No confirmation of survival. Minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, command marked her. Status is missing in action, but no one in that room believed she was simply gone. Because in the aftermath of the explosion, a final data pulse appeared on a secure channel, fragmented, incomplete, but unmistakably deliberate. Enough information to confirm everything she had suspected, and enough to prove that the enemy had been watching Allied command for years, step for ended not with resolution but with certainty. Whatever came next would not be about victory, it would be about fallout. The war did not pause. After the explosion, it lurched, within minutes of the compound's destruction. The battlefield shifted in ways no briefing could have predicted. Enemy units that had moved with precision only moments earlier now acted erratically, some retreating without orders, others advancing blindly into zones they had previously avoided. Allied intercepts spiked, flooding command channels with half-formed transmissions, emergency reroutes, and requests for clarification that no one could answer fast enough. It was as if a hidden spine had been snapped, and the body of the enemy machine was convulsing, unsure which way to fall, in the command room. Officers stared at screens that no longer matched their maps. Timelines unraveled. Carefully modeled predictions collapsed under the weight of new data. Someone reported that an enemy battalion had withdrawn from a key position with no resistance. Another voice shouted that a different sector was experiencing unexpected counterattacks. None of it aligned. Nothing followed doctrine, and at the center of the confusion was a single, unbearable question. What had she destroyed? The data burst she sent before the blast began to resolve in fragments. Analysts worked feverishly, piecing together damaged files, cross-referencing timestamps, reconstructing meaning from partial loss. What emerged was worse than anyone had feared. The enemy had not simply been listening to Allied communications. They had built adaptive models based on them. Decision trees. Command behavior. Forecasts. Probability maps that anticipated not just movements, but reactions. The war itself had been studied like a living organism. And now, that system was gone. But so was she. As the implications settled in, Command faced a new crisis, one of its own making. The information she uncovered implicated internal vulnerabilities so severe that releasing it broadly could fracture Allied coordination overnight. Trust, once broken, could not be reassembled quickly enough for wartime needs. Some officers argued for immediate disclosure. Others demanded suppression until verification was complete. Voices rose. Accusations surfaced. Old rivalries sharpened under pressure. Then came the report that shifted everything: a forward unit. Advancing cautiously through the area surrounding the destroyed compound, reported signs of movement after the explosion window. Footprints leading away from the blast zone. Not staggered. Not erratic. Deliberate. Calm. As if whoever had made them had known exactly when and where to walk. The room froze. If she was alive. Then she was moving without command support. Without extraction, and possibly without protection. Worse if the enemy had intended her to return. Then her survival introduced a terrifying ambiguity. Was she still a target? Or had she become something else? Orders were drafted and withdrawn. Search operations were proposed, then quietly canceled. No one wanted to be the officer who ordered a recovery that might reopen the very breach she had sealed with fire. No one wanted to say it aloud. But the logic was brutal and undeniable. Her survival complicated everything. As night turned to dawn, intercepted enemy communications revealed panic spreading through their ranks. Units reported loss of predictive coordination. Commanders complained of blindness. Several high-level transmissions went unanswered entirely. Within 48 hours, enemy supply movements faltered. Within a week, entire operational plans were abandoned. The war shifted. Historians would later describe it as a sudden loss of coherence, a moment when one side stopped seeming inevitable. But no report would explain why, because in classified rooms behind locked doors, commanders wrestled with a darker truth. The victory they were witnessing had been bought, with a decision they had never formally approved. A lone operative had chosen to destroy not just intelligence, but the enemy's understanding of the war itself, fact the cost of her own place within it. No body was recovered, no official rescue was ever logged, and the final message she sent decoded weeks later contained no plea, no explanation, no request for extraction, only a single line. They were watching us think. And then nothing. but in a moment no historian could fully explain. Everything changed. The war moved on, as wars always do, but it did so unevenly, as if something fundamental had been knocked out of alignment. In the weeks following the destruction of the compound, enemy operations grew hesitant, then fragmented. Supply convoys stalled without explanation. Command decisions contradicted one another. Entire units were repositioned only to be recalled hours later. Allied intelligence noted the shift, but struggled to define it. There was no single victory, no decisive battle to point to, just a slow, unmistakable erosion of coherence on the other side. The machine still existed, but it no longer understood itself. Official reports credited improved coordination, better timing, and pressure from multiple fronts. Her name did not appear in any of them. Internally, however, the tone was very different. Classified memoranda circulated among senior commanders describing a loss of enemy anticipatory capability. Another used a colder phrase: predictive blindness. Analysts compared intercepted communications from before and after the incident, and found a sharp decline in enemy confidence. Where once their messages spoke with certainty, now they asked questions. Where they had anticipated Allied moves, they now reacted to, later not at all. Something had been taken from them. But the cost of that? Absence weighed heavily. Her status remained unresolved. Missing in action.
Body.
No confirmed sighting. No recovery mission officially authorized. In private briefings, officers admitted what the paperwork avoided: extracting her was never attempted. The risk of reintroducing compromised pathways, of reopening the breach she had sealed, was deemed too great. The war required momentum. Momentum did not wait for ghosts. Personal effects recovered from a forward cache were cataloged and locked away. A worn notebook. A damaged transmitter. A folded scrap of paper tucked into the lining of her jacket. The note was never released publicly, but fragments were quoted in internal summaries. It described a realization that came too late to ignore that the enemy had not been spying in the traditional sense. They had been observing patterns, studying how decisions formed, learning how commanders thought under pressure. They weren't stealing secrets, she wrote. They were learning us. Years later, when portions of the operation were finally declassified, historians struggled to reconcile the official narrative with eyewitness accounts. A patrol report surfaced describing footprints leading away from the blast zone hours after the explosion, precise and unhurried. Another document referenced an unidentified Allied signal detected briefly on a secure frequency days later, too weak to trace. Too structured to dismiss as noise. It was filed as interference and forgotten, until someone noticed the tamped. It aligned with a decision made at High Command, a change in strategy that had not yet been communicated to field units. A decision the enemy had failed to anticipate for the first time in years. That coincidence was never explained. In the archives, one file remained sealed longer than the rest. When it was finally opened, it contained a surveillance log recovered from a secondary enemy facility, overlooked in the chaos after the compound's destruction. The log listed dozens of observed Allied behavioral patterns except the last entry, which stood apart from the rest. It described a lone operative leaving the perimeter after the blast, walking into the forest without urgency, without pursuit. The note beside it was brief and unsettling. Subject: does not behave as predicted. No follow-up analysis was recorded. The file ended there. To this day, military intelligence does not officially acknowledge what she recovered, how much she destroyed, or whether she survived long enough to see the war turn in the Allies' favor. Her mission remains a footnote in sanitized summaries. Her choices debated quietly in ethics seminars and closed-door briefings, because if she did survive, if she walked away, carrying the full understanding of how deeply the enemy had infiltrated the war, then the most unsettling possibility remains unaddressed. She may have known something that frightened her own commanders more than the enemy ever did, and the truth about what she saw that night, what she chose to erase, and what she may have carried with her into history is still locked in the archives,